Okay, so what we'll do now, and the way that I'd like to sort of get opening comments from everyone on specifically the question that Anjali left with us about how do you manage some of these risks better, and what is the role of policy and regulation in managing, say, curtailment risk, but also other risks that are plaguing the sector. And then I'm adding on to that the question of at what point does policy need to meet regulation? So regulation is not moving at the same pace as policy is, and is that a big impediment? And what can policy do to sort of further urge regulators and regulation to move at the same pace? We'll start with you, Mr. Srivastava.
Hello, everyone. The first issue I think you talked about was the proper allocation of risk. So, uh, I mean, our experience has been that the success of the project would essentially rest on the subject that you raised, uh, whether the risks are properly allocated. The usual weakness of how projects are structured by government or governmental agencies is that they want to keep the least risk with themselves. Now, the issue always I try to explain is that, I mean, finally the bill, the consumer is the one, or the government is the one that's bearing the final, is paying for the final cost. So if you put any risk that the developer is not correctly positioned to be bearing, then you are essentially increasing the cost of what he's billing you. A very common issue is land. Now, between a developer, between a procurer and the government, it is the government which is the most appropriately placed to arrange for land and to bear the responsibility of the land not being available. Very often it has been seen in India that we have had, say, road projects with a 3-year time for completing the project, in which the responsibility of providing the land rests with the government. You provide the land after 2.5 years. Obviously, the developer can't build the road in the remaining 6 months. Then he comes to you with a request for extension of time. All such requests are seen with a lot of suspicion. Either you hesitate to grant that, or there is some controversy over that. What we have done, for example, in the Riva project was that the day zero for the obligations of the developer to start is the day when 90% of the land is given to the developer. So if there is a delay in arranging for the land, that the developers' responsibilities are delayed accordingly. This has subsequently also been adopted by the standard bidding guidelines issued by the Ministry of Power. Apart from that, another example that you also talked about the difference between policy and regulation. Well, one of the things that we encountered was in the case of Riva, where Delhi Metro is the procurer. Delhi Metro was very keen that the delivery point should be Delhi. When we were deciding all this, at that time, policy issued by Government of India said that all interstate transmission of renewable energy would be free. However, the notification by the government had not been issued. With experiences that one draws from life, one knew that perhaps there could be a slip between cup and lip. So we insisted that the delivery point be Riva, so that if there is any ISTS charges imposed later, then it is clear that the risk for that rests with Delhi Metro, not with the developer. Had we not done so, and the developers, we had forced the delivery point to be Delhi, and the developers had bid thinking that there is no ISTS charges, and later the ISTS charges would have been imposed, which they were, then the project would have been a jeopardy. It is only because we correctly where the risk of delivery charges from Riva to Delhi rested with Delhi Metro, it is only because of that the project has moved ahead. Subsequently, as it happened, the order issued by Government of India said that there is no ISTS charges if it is for distribution companies. Later, there has been subsequent modification, but the initial order said that it is only for distribution companies, wherein Delhi Metro would have to bear the charges. Even little modification also says that you don't have to bear if it is within your RPO. Now, Delhi Metro's requirement is what they're taking is far beyond their RPO. So they would actually have to bear the transmission charges. But I mean, it is different from what we had thought initially, but at least the risk allocation has been appropriate, and that is what has ensured that the project has survived. Had that not been the case, the project would not perhaps have taken off at all.
Thank you. Really, really good, detailed examples of how the two need to be married to each other. And so, Paolo, taking that to you, there's been a lot of discourse around building political will, having the right policies. Is there such a thing as the perfect policy, monitoring policies? But are policies enough? And have there been enough anywhere in the world without sort of using policy to push regulation forward?
Let me try to respond, not getting in details, but making some general consideration. I said it also yesterday. If I look at how technology is evolving fast, and then I look at the evolution of policies, and now we have a third component, the regulators. Technology evolving super fast, policies, it depends on the country, and regulators very, very slow. Now, one comment and one word of sympathy for regulators. And by the way, India is not special. Don't think that your country is special. This is true everywhere. The regulators are usually the most conservative persons and stakeholders in this debate. But I have a word of sympathy for them, because they ultimately are the responsible of security of supply at any moment in time. And this has huge costs. Imagine that we had a blackout for one day. These are enormous costs. So let me start with a word of sympathy for the slowest moving stakeholders here. Now, the second point is something that was mentioned in the opening this morning, both by the minister and by the trustee. This is a system change. This is a massive change, not a marginal change. And we are facing the issue of pushing something new, the renewables, the variable renewables, high capex, no, not high cap, all capex and zero opex, in something which is old, which is the old market framework, which is old regulatory framework. This is what we are discussing about everywhere in the world, and this is indeed a difficult question. In a framework which does not internalize carbon cost, externalities, pollution, this is the huge point. Now, having this in mind, of course, huge problems cannot not be solved immediately, but there should be a roadmap. There should be a differentiation of what is very urgent now, what is a little bit less urgent, and what need to be taken in mind afterwards. And I mean, I stress that I'm from Rome, and we used to say in Rome and the Roman Empire was not built in one day. So you need to have a progress. Now, today, what is the biggest urgency? The biggest urgency is to attract investment and give a very clear signal in favor of the clean energy transition. And so whatever measures, and you listed many, that de-risk the investment in renewables has to have the priority right now, even if we understand that this is not cost optimized and this is the not perfect solution, but today that is the top priority, and I think you listed a very good list of tools how to get it. But then the second point is the second step where policymakers need to step in, and I think we had some discussion yesterday. We have to move into a PPA model that takes into account system integration issues, and that has as an objective the highest possible value of renewables to the system as opposed just to the lowest levelized cost generation costs. Examples, Mexico, in part South Africa, Argentina, there are a number of countries that are addressing this. I think that's the second urgency. The third urgency is and this will require more time, we have to think now about the right market design of the future. And these will need to be much more complex than it is today, because you will need some kind of long-term prices to attract investments in basically capex-intensive technology. This is true for renewables, but by the way, this is exactly the same thing for energy efficiency. Second, you need some short-term prices because you want to have an efficient dispatching. Third, you want to price the externalities in the right way. And fourth, you want to have a market for flexibility, because we know very well that if we just push solar and wind and we not create at the same time flexibility like storage, better grids, other dispatchable supply, demand side response, we will not get there. That's the issue. This is less urgent, but we have to think it now to have a solution in 10 or 15, maybe 5 years from now. And so that would be my take at this point. Here I would stop. Take a dynamic approach and making a very distinction of what is urgent now and what is urgent in 5 years and in 10 years from now.
He's calling you and your other regulator colleagues snails, Dr. Gouri.
No, I don't think he's calling us names. It's okay, snails. Snails we have to be. But what is very, very important, I think the point that Paolo is making, the whole role of the regulator has to change. You know, there has to be a transformation, and especially in our country, the ERCs and TRI have to change completely. And before I get to that, I think I'd like to get back to what Mr. Srivastava said about the DMRC and take it from the contract point of view, because it's in a certain sense a continuation. There's a change occurring, there's a systemic change occurring. Are we ready for it? And we'll come to the regulator later on, Paolo, because I know what it means to be a regulator on either side. And regulators, when they get ensconced, they're the biggest stakeholders in the system. They don't want to give it up. You know, in the past sector, we felt we were mini gods because we were setting the prices. And that's something that one has to really get out of it. But nonetheless, the regulator has a very crucial role to play within this country, and it is a kind of a lender of last resort. That's something it cannot be absolved from the regulator or from the government itself. Now, let's take this question of design of contracts. Who's going to bear the risk? And whether it is a case of renewable energy sources, or whether one is trying to look at it in terms of whether the consumer bears the risk, what has been happening so far? Let's be frank, a contract is between two individuals. And therefore, when a contract has been designed, all various elements of the risk is taken. And the most important point of risk is not only identification, but who takes the share. How is it devolved between two parties? You can't say one party will take one and the other won't. Now, as long as you have the existing system where you have the generator, whichever generator, and you have the DISCOM, then every risk gets passed on to the DISCOM. And when it gets passed on to the DISCOM, it comes on to the consumer. So the consumer pays in terms of tariff subsidies. And so I was very interested in hearing what DMRC did, because DMRC becomes the consumer by itself. But that's because your tariff structure is slightly different than it would be in terms of, you know, the DERC tariff structures compared to the other states. Now, why should the consumer take on all the risk? It has to be handled well. And when you look at it, none of the developers take most of the risk. They don't take any risk. Everything falls in the DISCOM, and that is not to be blamed, because that's how the entire act went only halfway, by the act, the Electricity Act, which is where I'd like to come back again to looking at what should be done. So when you have a contract thing, you look at demand risk. I know people were talking about you need data for demand and all. That's the investor's job. He has to find out how much is the demand. If he wants to invest, let him find out how much there is a demand. As a regulator, I will not give any of my data, because that is data that can be sold. And that's the due diligence the investor should do. The other thing is on the question of default risk, the financial risk, and how does one balance it out? So coming back to this, it is a negotiated instrument. And if the regulator enters into it, it is wrong. It is a court. It has to go to the court in terms of how you're dealing with it. Just 1 minute, and then I can get into the policy and regulation. In fact, that's what I want to get into is, if you are in a situation which yesterday's discussion was so stimulating, the evening discussion, and you have a situation where the division between the carriage on and the content has got aborted, all because of the licensing policy. I have to atone myself for giving a license to a discom for both the wires and the distribution or the question of supply of power for some 30 years. And now these licenses are coming for renegotiation, and a discom should be only a pure wires company. I think that was suggested earlier. Now, wait, I'll get on to why I'm saying it should be only a pure wires company and not should be a question of giving out supplies to various people, because that's where the politics come in. So if you have a model where the regulator is only looking at the natural monopoly content, your high capex, low opex, so marginal cost is almost non-existent. And this is what TRI is doing. You see, you look at the spectrum and the regulation and the trade-off and what is taking place. They haven't got it right as yet, but that's a problem that you find that is there still in the electricity sector, because unlike spectrum, transmission lines are only one. So the regulator comes in there. But between the generator, whichever generator it is, it could be an alternative, renewable, non-renewable, and the consumer has to get a set worked out. He works out a relationship and the contract. The first question people will ask is, what about the smaller people? What about the rural people? What about the urban people? Then becomes the design of how you get the markets. And if you can do it in telecom, you break up between voice and data. In this, you can break up between energy and capacity, energy and electricity. So you can work out what has to be done short term, long term, and every generator will always have a mix of consumers, because that is how you spread your risk. That's the portfolio risk pattern that's coming to it. So later on, when we look at it in terms of how we want to design new energy markets and how you make an input right now, can I take it up in the next round? Because otherwise I'm taking up too much time to myself, since this is a subject I love. But I think we really have to think fresh. And this is the moment, and I'm very confident because I've been associated with all of you. Here are youngsters who are willing to think new. And what becomes the role of the regulator? He not only regulates the wires, but he will retain some of the stranded assets. He will keep some of the projects, so there is no blackout. And the question then comes in is, when does he decide how to be able to renegotiate and what has to be done? So you have larger models, you have smaller models, and the role of the regulator changes.
Fantastic. So Sujoy, do you think that if the role of the regulator changed, that all of your troubles as a developer would go away?
Well, I think that will be a welcome change as and when it happens. No, I think developers today, the solar sector is staring at a situation where all this growth which is happening is not sustainable, right? We have on one hand tariffs which are being paid at prices which make very little sense for investment, a fair amount of investment return. So coming back to the point which I think Paolo raised about how do you de-risk, right? I think that's very important, but do developers really understand and price the risks in the first place? I think that is a larger question which we have to introspect within the developer community. And I think the other issue which we're beginning to see, and there was some discussions in the previous session, was really around the sustainability of these assets, right? There is a focus right now in all the documents, all the procurement guidelines around cost. And rightfully so. There should be a relentless focus on cost, but there should be also an additional focus on quality, on reliability, on if you're having a 25-year concession. So where are you defining those standards in terms of holding the developer responsible to ensure the assets built to last? and we don't see all of that. And the challenge which we foresee, 5 years down the line, is a lot of these platforms are going to liquidate. Some of them are going to raise public money. They'll all lever themselves up to about 80-90%, and you'll have the banks holding assets which are not performing properly. And I think while we debate on the role of the regulators, I think that's a very topical debate. But we should also look at the procurement guidelines which are currently issued, which only just focus on one headline number with very low barriers to entry and absolutely nil, focus on reliability, quality, environment, health and safety standards, use of child labor. You go to some of these plants and you see people, all kinds of practices happening, which would then deter sophisticated financial investors to come in and put money behind these projects. So how do you do all that would be a challenge. I think we welcome the government's at least a SECI policy around giving 24 months timelines now for executing projects. That was a much needed break for the industry, because 12 months to execute a project was like impossible. And but then there are these woes which developers have bought onto themselves, and I think we need to have a dialogue around those issues also.
Thank you. Chintan, while you are today wearing a financier hat, but you're an old hand at this and you seem to understand it better than most. So, can you maybe tell us from your point of view, given all the policy push that is coming sort of at the very high top level, but not necessarily addressing some of the more nuts and bolts issues, what do you think needs to happen? And how much of that is actually the role of policy to sort the nuts and bolts issues?
I think the intent at the policy level is very positive. We all know that. They've been increasing the targets to 225 gigawatts now from 175, and there's also the increased push to have Make in India. However, what is happening on the ground is not somehow in the same continuum. Now, I've been always saying this before also, that when you do bidding, it leads to imports. Because that's the philosophy of bidding. You import from the cheapest possible place of the world. Now, the question is that let's decide first. We want to actually benefit the country in terms of GDP also, in terms of manufacturing, or you just want to have a lower price. But that's a call somebody has to take. Now, if you've seen in the past also, whenever India did competitive bidding or reverse auction in capital goods category, it led to imports. Ultra mega power project is a well-known example. Everything came from overseas. So is the case with solar also, because that's the philosophy of bidding. Now, on the other side, you had wind projects happening in India on a almost 90% Make in India basis. 90% got indigenized over here. Why? Because they had a visibility of volume and a visibility of price. So manufacturers came up and set up shops in India. Be it GE, be it Vestas, be it Siemens, every global manufacturer is in India, because there was a visibility of the market. That's how manufacturers view. Now, if we give a visibility, I don't say give 4 rupees or 5 rupees or whatever, but give a reasonable tariff on a fit-in tariff. I think we have done fair amount of price discovery by now. So can we look at a different approach where we adapt the known visible price, the discovered price, under Section 62 of the Electricity Act, and make it fixed till you achieve the target of 225 gigawatt? So what will happen? You have a visibility of pricing. You have a visibility of numbers. Just do this thing, you have created an enabling environment for manufacturers to come. Then everybody will set up their shop in India. Today, people would be feeling in different directions. Should we put up a manufacturing unit in India or not? Because there is no visibility in these two things. We have targets, but targets without a pricing has no meaning, because huge amount of capital investment is required to set up the shops. Now, that's the only thing which has been missed out. And I think if this type of policy push happens, where you adopt the tariff itself now, you discovered it. What more discovery you want?
But the economy-wide cost of a tariff fixed at 4 rupees or 3 rupees versus if this price discovery kept bringing them down to say 1.5 or sub 2 rupees, what about that? Because you can't have very large capacity at very high prices.
A small example, you put up $100 million power project. Either you import it and create a $2 million service-based economy. Other option is make in India. We have $102 million added to the GDP. That's the only difference. Manufacturing is a GDP multiplier. See, one thing is very clear. Why road projects doesn't have reverse auction? Because you want to create market for your cement and steel industry in India. It's a core sector. The core sector goes up, everything goes up. It's a GDP multiplier. You can jolly well have a reverse auction for road projects. You end up importing steel and cement.
But isn't access to more power, so increasing the overall availability and quality of power supply at lower prices also a driver of manufacturing? Maybe
Well,
not of manufacturing solar, but of manufacturing in general.
Well, what you're saying is right from the economic perspective, but you have a huge opportunity to create a GDP for manufacturing because such big targets are not there anywhere in the world. It's a golden opportunity. You create an entire manufacturing base over here. You can also start exporting from here. So that's the type of multiplier I'm talking about: employment generation, technology creation, investments here for manufacturing and exports, and also basically a hub on the international market as a RE manufacturing hub. So I mean to say this is a different perspective, and this is purely a different type of call one has to take. What I mean to say is that if you keep on doing reverse auction, uh, what discovery you're doing now? You have, I think, almost 2.5 years of reverse auction. We have the numbers. We also know what's there on ground reality. So we have a fair amount of idea. See, reverse auctions are very good to discover. Even China initially did a reverse auction for wind and as well as solar. Then they adopted feed-in tariff. Today, China actually has a feed-in tariff for wind as well as solar. That's the reason they're adding 40 gigawatts every year. That's the only reason. Because you have visibility there.
I'm not sure it's the only reason, but on that very contentious note, we're going to open it up for a round of questions and then I will come back with more questions.
But one more thing which I wanted to tell.
Yeah, while we're getting the mics out.
Entire thing is about curtailment. I think we didn't discuss about it much. Actually, no. See, there are 12 combinations possible in a contract as far as curtailment is concerned. So you have connectivity injection point at 3 levels, either the central grid operator level, the state grid operator level, or at distribution level. Again, you have 3 offtake instruments, either it's a PPA, or it's open access, or it's captive. And again, the 3 combinations where you are exiting at a central grid level, at a state grid level, or at a distribution company level. Now, the entire risk analysis is based on these 12 combinations. If you are injecting at central grid level and exiting central grid level, there will be definitely no issue on the commercial side in terms of curtailment. There can be a technical reason for curtailment because a grid operator is supposed to be agnostic to the generator and the user. So you will give equal opportunity to everybody. Same is true also at state grid operator level, which is STU, what we call it in India. The worst portion is when you're injecting at a discom level and exiting at discom level, because then you are at the mercy of the discom. But the discom itself is an operator, and discom itself is either the beneficiary or the loser. So one has to look at different risk parameters, and that's what we do as a lender. When people come to us, 2 things are asked: a load flow report, which is the technical portion, and what is the injection point, and where are we exiting. Based on which we do a risk assessment when you do an appraisal report.
Okay, can we get a mic?
Yes, Suman Berry, formerly with Shell. 2 questions, one for the private sector people and then one for Geeta. What is the reality of state governments, in a sense, reneging on PPAs generally, but in the renewable area because prices have been coming down? Is this myth or is this reality? And can you give us cases? Geeta, you made a very important point which relates more to the previous panel about data. And so what is your view? What is the view of the panel on whose data it is? Is it public domain data? Is it private data? How is it to be bought?
take a few questions together. There's one at the back, I think. Right there. Do you want to raise your hand slightly higher? Okay, I feel like there's been a change of heart there. Okay, so Sujoy, we'll start with you.
So the behavior which we are seeing from the states is not really reneging on existing contracts. At least I speak for the solar industry, which is, most of the PPAs are through a price discovery mechanism through a reverse auction. What is happening is that new auctions are getting cancelled. So we've seen this in Gujarat, we've seen this in Andhra Pradesh, where let's say there's an auction which happens, the PPA is not allotted, but by the time the price discovery happens, there is another price discovery which is at a lower tariff. So the first state actually cancels the the whole auction process and then restarts this whole thing after 6 months. But in solar, we've not seen reneging of contracts. However, the worrying trend for us is, especially on state procurement, is the extent of the receivables is going up and the aging of the receivables is going up, right? So we've seen this in even A-rated discoms also, where let's say earlier they used to pay maybe 80% of your bills within 2 months. Now we're going to pay 70% 3 months. Now it's going up to like 5 months and 60%. So that's the worrying trend for at least solar developers. Maybe Chintan from his past experience can talk about wind, where there was some renegotiation of feed-in tariff-based PPAs.
I think that everybody tried that, but finally, I think the sense prevailed because of the intervention by Niti Aayog that sanctity of contract is at most important in India, and it should not be pursued. So I think it ended everything. So now nothing is there in terms of renegotiation of contract or not honoring of contract. What may happen is momentary issues. For example, that's happened in Andhra Pradesh, where they're saying that we are retaining the price money beyond 23.5% PLF because that's what the commission had decided. So we don't know what's the tariff beyond 23.5. So these are smaller issues which would anyway keep on coming and keeping on resolved. But otherwise, the PPAs are touchwood till now. Nothing has been changed.
I know Suman, and that's why he's asked such a very, very interesting question. It's really a very critical point. He said, whose data is it? Now, everything, and if you're going into a market economy, and that's what the important part of it, even if you're a bulk consumer and you get a different tariff, it's a different thing, is that if data is so crucial, then obviously it matters who has the data. And is it necessary, for example, the sort of data which Mr. Batra talked about, that it should be given out to everyone? Or is it not possible for someone to try and make money on that data? And I don't think there's anything wrong if either the SLDC data, and SLDC, let me tell you, doesn't give out data. They're very, very finicky even giving data to the regulatory commissions. They give data maybe to the discoms, and the discoms doesn't give enough data. So we try and build up alternate data. That's why I'm telling you, when you have the discom, which is also an area distributor, not a pure-wise company, and then the transmission company is also owned by the same, and the SLDC is not, none of them are agnostic. The word we use is agnostic. And when you're going into a market playing system, the question of what data will be given and who's going to try and sell it out. Data has to be sold, it's precious, and who does it and for what purpose is a negotiating instrument again. And therefore, when I talk about contracts, this is slightly different from licensing. The licensing is a different thing, the contracts is a different thing, and then we have to redesign all the question of long-term, short-term markets, everything. That becomes different. That's why I think the point that was raised is very valid, it is very critical, and it has to be looked at very carefully.
But data is sold so that investment decision, for instance, could be made, or business decisions can be made based on that. But imagine if all data was public, there wouldn't be a market for it. You would be able to use it to make money in business, yes, but there wouldn't be a market for data because it would all be public.
No. Let me try and clarify again. What do you mean by being public? Is it on the public domain? No. A lot of the data which is critical is never in the public domain. It cannot be. No, you cannot handle these. These are, you see, the data is something that can be used by anyone for whichever purpose they want to take it up for. You know, it's not only the question of what you're going to use for the data. Are you also creating a market for some data? Is there, I'm not talking about privacy issue, which also will comes up, but there's also the question of the security of the data. Now, where electricity is concerned, that becomes prime importance that is going to be there. Now, you know, it's a very, very, very gray area. It's a thin area. And therefore, suppose I say, would SLDC sell the data? No, they might give it out, but only to a few people under contract, under certain obligations, and there has to be certain requirements that come up. Would a transmission company or a distribution company give the data because they have all the sales data and one can work out? No, they won't. Because you're in the market competing with others who are going to come in. You're creating competition, but what has happened now? You neither create competition, nor do you create markets, nor do you give out data. So you must decide which part of that scenario are you entering and how you're going to deal with it. And to take on data and to find it, my personal opinion is, if you're wanting to enter the data, you start from the basic and create your own data.
So and actually, that's a really good segue to, because I wanted to ask you this question as well, Mr. Srivastava, is create your own data, and you're doing a lot of that, and you're creating, I know, these dedicated data rooms for the REVA project, but also for the upcoming project. But access into these data rooms is not open. It is, because I remember I said, can I have access to your data room?
The only requirement is to buy the tender document, which is fairly inexpensive. I mean, see, I would understand that the data, what if the purpose, let's park the issue of what is the basic rationale of the entire tendering exercise. Sujoy made the point, should it be only price? Chintan also made the point, but let's park the issue, but assuming that being the only consideration. And of course, I appreciate the point that there should be technical standards, there should be standards regarding environment, health. That point is fairly taken. But those being given, if price is the only consideration, then I believe as a public authority, it is fair for you to provide the data to everyone if it helps them in reducing, I would again use the word, reducing the risk assessment that they have, and to come at a more informed decision regarding how they would be bidding. The two examples that you gave in case of REVA, for example, we had created a data room in which all the land that we had, we put it on a map. We showed this is the project map. We have this part of the land which we own, which is in our possession, which is shown in a certain color. And as the bidding progressed, the bidders could see that the part of the land that we had was increasing. And on the day of bidding, we had 98% land with us. So the bidders knew that whomsoever wins, our PPA talked of day zero of the obligation being 90% land. So they knew that the day the bidding is over, we can give them the land. And so there was no uncertainty. The bidding took place in February. We could transfer the land and sign the PPAs in April, only because the VIP's concern took some time in reaching Bhopal, only because of that. In the new project that we are talking about, which Kanika just talked about, there is a small rest project. Data room that we have created, we have around 500 buildings. For each one of the buildings, we have a Google map. We have a suggested layout of the panels, taking into account the shadow. If there is a tree and there is shadow of the tree on the building, then on the roof, then the panels are not put there. We have even given an estimation of the number of panels, number of inverters, the length of cable down to the point so many meters. So we have given that, we have given electricity bills of the building, and we have done it for each one of the 500 buildings. So the idea is that if we give that information to the bidder, he would make a more informed decision regarding what the price would be. Another way to do it could have been that, well, we have 500 buildings, we won't tell you the name of the buildings, it's secret. You give one number for Madhya Pradesh. I mean, that suits everyone because, you know, a 2 kilowatt police thana gets the same rate as a 2 megawatt medical college. So everyone in the state is happy. But rather than that, we have allowed different rates for different categories of buildings. All data about all the buildings is known to the bidder, and it only needs to for you to be claiming that you fill the tender. So even if CEEW Kanika claims that it would fill the tender and buys the tender for $5,000, I think, then you can see all the data.
You know, there's a point that I think we should bring up, because that's the point you made. Who do you give the data to? You see, the important point is you have given data to those who are wanting to come into the bidding. And the kind of data that you're going to give is also something that would be required for him to make an informed decision, which is very different by saying that all data should be available and on sale and in the public domain. Actually, you have to be much more nuanced in how you're going in terms of the data.
The point is taken, but in reality, the difference doesn't amount to much. Because I also face this problem, that when we chose the buildings for which we would do the RESCO tender, large number of them are government buildings, which would anyway be a part of a tender, but there are also private institutions, private universities. Now I run the risk that if I give a photograph of a certain Google map and all the details of a certain private university, a private developer can just go across to him and say, why do you get into this tender? I can give you power at 3 rupees. I run this risk. However, the problem is that in practical reality, how do you differentiate? There could be someone who claims to be a bidder, does not bid, and does it behind your back. So I mean, when you have to err, I decided to err on the side of giving more data rather than withholding data, because the cost of withholding data I thought would have been more. We could have withheld all the data, said there is some organization, we would not give you any more, but we tried to give as much information as possible. And well, even if some private party gives a rate lower than us, that's the only way he can be from stealing us, that customer, from us. If he gives a lower rate, fair enough, let that happen.
Sorry to interrupt again, but you're giving data which Google is giving you. So it's really Google which is giving you, because you kept saying you give the Google map and which
we give electricity bills as well.
Yeah, okay. So you're
bills.
adding, and in terms of even getting the electricity bills, no, I won't tell you how it can be got without going to it, because an investor would always go through different processes of it, and you can estimate. Let me just
No, you're absolutely right. You can estimate, but there is a very high cost of collecting that data through these many different routes, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of investors don't have a dedicated renewable energy India desk. Right? So then they're just like, oh, the transaction cost of collecting all of this data and doing all this due diligence is too high. IREDA will do it, but maybe not sort of
but that's because we're not giving them the market for it. You see, it again gets connected up. If you're going to say, I'm going to buy only this gigawatts and it's going to be purchased by the discoms, and you don't have a question of a larger market and an openness, which is what your Section 42 does, then why would investors want to come in? So, you'll be going back again and again into the same vicious circle.
Yeah. Arnava?
Thanks. I have a first principles question. Because in this panel, we have a developer, we have a former regulator, we have a current investor, and we have a policymaker. What is the objective function for India's renewable energy development? Is it deployment? Is it manufacturing? Is it lowest cost? Is it new generation of technologies? I mentioned this last evening, that we were now exactly 10 years since the National Action Plan on Climate Change was first announced. And we could have argued at the time that the objective function was evolving. 10 years in, and this is, of course, there's a much longer history of wind deployment in the country. It seems to me that we are still unsure that as a country, what do we want to do with renewables? So could
the panelists wearing their respective hats, give us a sense if the panel has some consensus on the objective function for renewable energy in India.
Start with you, Paolo.
Robert, thank you very much for this question, because I think it summarizes well a very interesting debate that we are having here. I would say today the objective function of renewables, and not just in India but in everywhere, is that they become a crucial central pillar of a massive clean energy transition. Now, this has a number of implications, and what we are discussing here actually is two things. One, how to manage a complex transition where many things are in place. And second, what is the right mix of planning and market? So all these questions about the data, but also the other determinants, who is deciding what. And let me profit to make a few comments on what Mr. Shah was saying before. Visibility of prices. I prefer much more to give this to the market. Because you mentioned China, but China just stopped the feed-in tariffs on solar. And why? Because they ran the auctions and the prices were halved in one shot, in a few months. And this is why they stopped it. And it's dramatically different for administration to cite the right price in a very fast evolving technology. On the other hand, on the visibility of the amount, I think there is a massive role for policy. Because you were right, Geeta, saying this should be the risk of the developers, the due diligence. But this is only happen in a perfect market and where the framework conditions are clear. The framework conditions here are not clear. Carbon is not priced. The cost of air pollution is not priced. And so here, I think, and this is relevant for the demand risk, there is a main issue and role for policymakers. Because also we haven't spoken about, but there is another elephant in the room which is called energy efficiency, which we are all in favor for, but then this obviously reduces the demand. So if all the risk is on discoms or on the utilities, they are in a big trouble. That's a very, in my opinion, the policy role in the visibility of the amount remains very important because we are managing a clean energy transition. And I'm coming back on the objective function. Then you posed the question about manufacturing. Very legitimate, and you discussed it too. Very legitimate question. All these projects will only be sustainable in the longer term if they are capable to bring some benefits on the local communities and the people in the country. The question is this better obtained with voluntary approaches, or so expanding the market and expanding the opportunities, or with mandatory approaches like the local contents or import tariffs? I prefer the voluntary approaches much more. The opportunity side is much bigger than imposing other constraints that actually are a barrier for the investors. So I think, thank you again. For me, responding, the real objective function is the clean energy transition, and we are seeking for the right mix of government intervention and the market rules. And by the way, this is true everywhere in the world. You take Chile, the most market-oriented country in the world, they are realizing very clearly that the market alone does not drive the transition alone, and that they have to have some kind of planning regarding grid integration. And so this is just the opposite approach. We are converging on the same issue of having the right mix of government intervention and market.
Totally agree with Paolo. I think our view is exactly the same. The primary reason is decarbonization of the energy sector, which is extremely important, and the pace at which it will happen is a function of the affordability of the energy. So, market participants need flexibility in terms of choosing supply instead of being mandated or forced to go to one particular state or one particular source. And I think, the larger point of manufacturing of solar panels in India, I think the larger debate is whether manufacturing of semiconductors, which is, the family to which solar panels belong to, is competitive on its own strength. I mean, any manufacturing in today's global scenario should be looking at being competitive in a global context without the support of mandates and tariff barriers. We've seen that fail in the US. We've seen that fail in Europe, where anti-dumping and safeguard duties were imposed. So to me, when we spending, I think, too much of focus on solar PV manufacturing without analyzing the amount of jobs the rest of the supply chain, the rest of the value chain is creating in terms of O&M, in terms of rooftop, in terms of construction jobs. Solar PV manufacturing is a highly automated process, right? And so maybe, a gigawatt of operations creates about 300, 400 white collar jobs. That's what we're talking about. Yes, it does create a lot of investment from a GDP point of view, which Chintan referred to. But I think the wind manufacturing, the solar manufacturing are an apples to oranges comparison. We can have a separate debate on that, but the primary reason is very similar to what Paolo said.
I just agree with my other two panelists, because I think the most critical thing now in our country is the question of getting clean air. I mean, there are no arguments about it. Whether you want it by renewable energy, or you want it through washed coal, or you want to do it in any manner. And the ways of getting at the clean energy part of it. But the point you raised, which was extremely relevant, is how does one go about it? And here the problems really is that you have to combine the question of going towards market orientation with a complete total change of several policies in several ministries. And therefore, yesterday also the point was raised that it is a question of technology, it's a question of innovations, it's a question of the patenting system, it's a question of how the right signals have to be sent out. And in this, what kind of approach and what is the kind of nudge that should be given in terms of the policies? How do you get every single person being concerned about environment? And let us not be very elitist to think that we are bothered, because it's really the very poor who are so badly affected by this environment and this kind of issues that they have to take up, and they're bothered about it. So how do you deal with it? What is the dialogue that has to be built up? What is the kind of equation that has to be taken? And I think it's very important here. For example, the thing that bothered me considerably, for example, this cutting of trees. South Delhi. They were going to build up more government quarters because we need government quarters, that's fine. It may not be a very good example, but it shows how you're going to approach it. And you had pro and anti. And I get Twitters or whatever, Facebook from activists and non-activists. And the debate becomes, you're pro the government or you're anti the government, which means you're pro BJP or non-BJP. That's not the issue. Why is it that so far in India, most of our buildings are so unaesthetic and so environmentally unfriendly? Because we have not created the situation, and wherever it chooses, we come down to the case of income. Now, whatever you might say, the way China approached it, China, it doesn't matter. Even if 1,000 people die in the 1,000 gorgeous thing, no one cares about it. We are a democratic institution. We have to find a policy decision. And I think in this 5 minutes, it's very difficult because, there's so many details that need to be worked out, and you've touched a very sensitive issue and a new area that one needs to work on.
Just to continue on the same note, see, when we talk about manufacturing, you're forgetting the vendor base you create. See, a typical example is the auto sector. When Hyundai comes to India, there are vendors also come to India. If Yamaha comes, a vendor comes. So when you're talking about a manufacturing ecosystem, the final product may be a solar module, but the back end and the ancillaries also create fair amount of employment and movement of money in the economy, which is the key. So money is getting stuck in the economy today. So that is what I was looking at. Like in case of wind, I can tell you, there are more than 4,000 vendors employing about 2 million people. So that's the type of vendor base you're creating. Finally, somebody is only manufacturing a turbine, like Siemens comes up. But they're procuring everything from different vendors. So you create an ecosystem. And that's the ecosystem which I was talking about. That's exactly what China has created. China has an entire ecosystem for solar, everything. Similar ecosystem needs to be created for any manufacturing. It need not be just solar. That's one thing. But one more thing which came to my mind was, again, the basic topic of distribution companies doesn't want renewables for a variety of reasons, commercial reasons, and variability and all. What one thing needs to do now is a next level of awareness generation. Everybody is aware that renewables is good. Everybody wants renewables. But tell me, as a consumer, do you have a choice from a distribution company to ask for renewables? No. No regulator has actually determined tariff for a consumer to buy renewable energy. No, you don't. Okay, fine. So I think more importantly is regulators need to come out with a consumer tariff. If a consumer is demanding renewables, as a consumer, I say I want 20% renewables or 30% renewables, and there's a rate for it. The moment a consumer is driving the consumption for renewables, I tell you, discoms are your best friend. Then they'll procure more renewables. Today, what is happening? A consumer is agnostic. He knows that certain percentage is coming from renewables. But as a consumer, I will say I want to buy 100% green power. I don't mind paying 3 rupees more. There's a tariff schedule available by the commission, consumer tariff schedule. This was attempted by APRC about 4 years back. That's the only state that did it. It was 7 rupees. A consumer can ask for a green energy. But after that, the commission is over. I mean to say the state got bifurcated. The tariff order has no meaning today. I think it's a right opportunity. Awareness is there. You just require a strategy. The consumer can ask for renewable energy and he can pay more price to it. So you create a different type of a demand. And this council will not have any curtailment, I can tell you. They need to procure green because somebody is paying for it. Right. Today the question is, it gets agnostic. So that's the only point.
I think the point that was just raised would have been true perhaps sometime earlier when we had not reached the grid parity. I would say that the main goal that we would have are there are two boxes that need to be ticked. One is the economic box and the other is the moral or the policy box. Say 1 year back when we had not reached the grid parity price, then one could have said that renewable was a costly option, so it did not tick the economic box. However, it ticked the moral or policy box. On the other hand, there could be another option which ticks the economic box but does not tick the moral box. Perhaps robbing a bank could be an example. But if there is an option which ticks both the boxes, the economic box and the moral box, then perhaps is a natural stage for that principle or that technology or that thing to fly. And we have reached that stage with renewable. So I always say that now we have entered a virtuous cycle where the low cost is driving the increase in demand. And the example that Chintan shared, I would just try to give a few examples about the same. We had some team visiting us from Assam. And I must tell you, for those of us who are not in the government, I mean, most of the governments have two departments, energy and renewable energy. So let's say, let's put it very, very mildly, they don't have, very often they're not on the best of terms. So I was talking, the team of Assam visiting us. Now, it was, they are short of power, unlike many other states which have excess power purchase agreements. They are short of power and they needed to set up a new plant. They were agnostic to which power plant it was. And to my surprise and in great interest, they decided on a new solar plant, and the decision was made by their Assam Power Generating Company. Assam Power Generating Company has been traditionally a thermal company. I mean, most state generating companies are entirely thermal companies. So the decision was taken by the lady who's the MD of the power generating company, and she was the forefront of taking this decision entirely on commercial considerations. Another example I would give is of Delhi Metro procuring power from us from the REWA project. Delhi Metro was procuring power from the Delhi Discom. It is not an obligated entity. It was taking power just like Hayat does, or perhaps CEEW does in its office. And the decision to take renewable power was, apart for their commitment and interest in green energy, was primarily for commercial considerations. Delhi Discoms were giving them power at 7 rupees a unit, which perhaps was increasing every year. and they got power at less than 3 from the Riva project. I've just come here from after meeting with railways. So railways is again procuring power from a project in Madhya Pradesh. We're setting a 1500 megawatt project. So again, railways interest goes beyond meeting their RPO. And now then it's a wonderful time that if the prices are below the prices from thermal power plant, then I suppose we have reached a stage then it makes all the sense to go it for it, both for environmental considerations and for economic considerations and for anyone concerned with the renewable energy sector. I think it's a beautiful time to be in this sector where both economy and morality ask you to work in the same direction. And I must tell you that my daughter is at a stage where she's deciding what to do. And she feels so happy about what I do. And she says that, well, you're doing your job, but doing something that's good for the world. So I believe it's a very, I mean, some of my friends are working in, for example, Coke. So it feels good not to be selling Coke.
I think that's a wonderful note to stop this session. We could go on all afternoon, but I can almost hear your stomachs growling. So we'll stop here. And I'd like to thank all the panelists. I think I mean, Mr. Srivastava's last words are really also the conclusion of this session, the energy transition and the need for an energy transition, which comes sort of now at a price that is affordable and it's within view, is what is going to drive India's renewable energy market forward, which in turn will drive the transition. So you're right, it is a virtuous circle. So with that, to each of you, thank you very much. This has been a really engaging session for me, and I've learned a lot. And I'm going to hand it over to Selna, who stands between you and lunch.